They called her Little Miss Protocol, and the nickname had teeth. Dr. Marcus Hargrove started it 3 months ago, voice dripping with patronizing sweetness whenever Natalie Hayes suggested adjustments to treatment plans during rounds. The other nurses laughed along, a survival instinct in a hierarchy where laughing with the chief of surgery meant staying in his favor. Natalie never laughed. She never flinched either. She simply returned to her patients, her hand steady, her jaw set at a precise angle that suggested she was cataloguing every word for future reference. Valley Memorial's ICU hummed with the sound of ventilators and cardiac monitors. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like an endless mechanical heartbeat, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made skin look paper-thin. 6 years. Natalie had worked this floor for 6 years, and in that time she had become the kind of nurse other nurses trusted with their own family members. The kind who could talk a panicking resident through a central line placement without making them feel stupid. The kind whose hands never shook during a code, whose voice stayed level when the monitor showed asystole, a straight line, flat line, gone, and somehow she made it sound like a problem with a solution instead of a funeral announcement. What they didn't know was that her composure came from somewhere deeper than nursing school. What they didn't know was that the way she stood, spine straight, feet shoulder-width apart, weight balanced like she was ready to move in any direction, came from years of learning to survive in places where hesitation meant death. The scars on her forearms, faint white lines that caught the light when she reached for an 4-start kit, weren't from kitchen accidents. She kept her sleeves long even in the humid Norfolk summers, even when the AC struggled and the ICU felt like a sauna. Nobody asked questions. In hospitals, people learned not to. Her locker was bare except for one object. A single dog tag on a broken chain. No name. No service number. Just worn metal, tarnished silver that caught her thumb every time she touched it. She did this before every shift, a ritual so brief, so private, that even the nurses who arrived at the same time never noticed. Her hand would slip into the locker, fingers would find the metal, and then the locker would close and Natalie Hayes would be a trauma nurse again, nothing more. Room for 47 occupied the corner of the East Wing, a private space usually reserved for the sickest patients and the most complicated cases. The man in that bed had arrived 3 weeks ago from a forward operating base in Ramadi, Afghanistan. Major Ryan Caldwell. 31 years old. Compound fractures in both legs, a crushed left arm, and a traumatic brain injury that had stolen something more precious than any of the broken bones. His memory. His wife had cried at his bedside for the first week. His mother had prayed. But the brain injury, contracode trauma from the IED blast that had flipped the convoy truck, had left him in a place where recognition felt like a luxury he no longer had access to. What made room for 47 different was the tattoo. Natalie noticed it the first time she helped transfer him to the ICU bed. His left forearm, just below where the cast began, black ink in careful military lettering, Natalie Hayes. Not a girlfriend's name. Not a wife's. A name that meant something else entirely, something that lived in a classified file somewhere in the Pentagon, something that had earned him the right to carry those letters on his skin like a tribute to the woman who had carried him. She had done it once, in Ramadi. 2011, a convoy patrol gone wrong, 2 operators down with shrapnel wounds, enemy fire coming from 3 positions, extraction point 3 miles north. She had picked up the major. He wasn't a major then, just Lieutenant Caldwell, because he was the heaviest and because the other operator was bleeding out from a femoral wound that needed a tourniquet and high ground pressure she couldn't apply while moving. 3 miles through urban terrain with bullets snapping past like angry hornets. Her lungs burning. His weight anchoring her to the earth. The sound of a Black Hawk's rotors getting closer. And when they loaded him into the bird, he had looked at her with eyes that said everything, and she had simply turned back for the other operator because that's what you did. You didn't stop. You didn't look back. You completed the mission. Now, 3 weeks into his recovery at Valley Memorial, Major Caldwell stared at her with blank eyes during vitals checks. She would wrap the blood pressure cuff around his arm, and his gaze would move across the room like she was part of the furniture. The tattoo on his forearm meant nothing to him anymore. The neural pathways that connected the letters to the memory had been severed. The brain injury had taken away the recognition. She would check his full line, adjust his pain medication, and he would follow her with those distant, polite eyes, the eyes of a man being cared for by a stranger. Natalie had learned a long time ago not to expect recognition. Recognition was a luxury. Recognition got you killed. So she had chosen to be the best nurse he could have instead, even if he never remembered why her name was burned into his skin. The morning Hargrove swept into the ICU, the whole floor seemed to hold its breath. He moved like a general inspecting troops, trailing a group of visiting residents behind him like a wake. The residents were all sharply dressed, eager, still believing that hierarchy existed for good reasons. They didn't understand yet that it existed for power, and power was just another word for the ability to make other people small. "Gentlemen," Hargrove said, his voice carrying across the unit with the practiced ease of a man used to being heard. "Let me show you what happens when protocols exist and are not followed." He had paused near the central station, and Natalie had been standing there reviewing medication records. She had felt his eyes on her before she looked up. "Miss Protocol," he said, and 3 of the residents smiled. "Perhaps you could explain to our visiting team from Johns Hopkins why you thought it was your place to recommend a change to the antibiotic regimen in room for 51 yesterday." The room went dead silent. Natalie had not blinked. She had not looked away. She had simply closed the medication binder with a deliberate motion and turned to face Hargrove directly. The patient's renal function had declined, she had said, her voice steady and level. Vancomycin dosing required adjustment to prevent nephrotoxicity. I documented the recommendation at 1,400 hours. You documented a recommendation, Hargrove had repeated, letting the words hang in the air like an indictment. Not a treatment, not a decision, not an order. A recommendation. Nurses document. Doctors decide. He had smiled then, and the residents had smiled with him, uncertain exactly what they were witnessing but confident it was a lesson. "Thank you for the reminder." He had turned away, and Natalie had returned to her work. Her hands had remained steady. Her jaw had tightened only slightly. The trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint, so much restraint that it felt like holding a grenade by the pin. A single tear had tried to form after he passed, but she had blinked it away before it could fall. Never let them see it. Never give them that satisfaction. But that wasn't the first time. 3 months of this, 3 months of Little Miss Protocol at the start of rounds, 3 months of watching him position himself as the architect of every successful outcome and the documentarian of every nurse's mistake. He had started small. A comment about her suggestion being enthusiastic but uninformed. A joke about nurses who watch too many hospital dramas. An email to the nursing director questioning her independent decision-making patterns that had required a meeting and a formal response from her charge nurse. And then the residents started arriving. Hargrove had begun using her as a teaching tool. A cautionary tale. The example of what happened when hierarchy got confused. Natalie checked the vitals on room for 47 an hour after Hargrove's morning rounds. Major Caldwell was asleep, his chest rising and falling in the measured rhythm of a man on morphine. His blood pressure was stable. His oxygen saturation was 97%. She adjusted his full line and looked at the tattoo again, her name in permanent ink on a man who no longer knew who she was. The irony was almost elegant. He had once known her well enough to trust her with his life. Now she was just another nurse changing his bandages. She had worked in a place that demanded absolute certainty. A place where hesitation killed people and second-guessing got soldiers buried in Arlington. She had learned to trust her own judgment because trusting anyone else's was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had carried wounded men across hostile terrain because protocols were things they wrote in manuals, and manuals didn't account for the fact that someone's brother might be bleeding out and the only way to save him was to run faster than you thought possible. Now she worked in a hospital where a doctor with the bedside manner of an angry ego could tell her that her judgment was dangerous. But that judgment had saved lives. That judgment was going to matter more than either of them knew. The Thursday Grand Round started at 0800 with visiting residents from Johns Hopkins, Duke, and Eastern Virginia Medical School crowding the Valley Memorial Conference Room like witnesses at an execution. 40 pairs of eyes. 3 institutions. 1 predator with a podium. Hargrove stood at the front in his white coat, the fabric pressed so sharply it could cut paper, reviewing cases with the measured cadence of a prosecutor building a case. His voice had that particular timbre, smooth as diesel fuel in a tank idling in a garage, designed to make everyone in the room feel like they were watching something important unfold. When he pulled up Natalie's chart note from Tuesday, his smile thinned to a blade. "Here we have Nurse Hayes," he announced, not looking up from the screen. Questioning a surgical consult timeline. Suggesting that perhaps the attending surgeon didn't understand the urgency of his own patient's condition. He read her note aloud in a voice dripping with theatrical concern. Nurses who think they understand complex decision trees usually end up creating liability nightmares for everyone. Natalie stood against the back wall where she'd been instructed to position herself, visible, vulnerable, exactly where he needed her for maximum exposure. The residents laughed nervously, the kind of laughter that comes from not wanting to miss the social cue. They looked at her with the mixture of pity and contempt reserved for someone being publicly dismantled by institutional authority. She took one measured breath. In through the nose. The kind of breathing technique drilled into Special Forces operatives during interrogation resistance training. Her jaw remained unclenched. Her eye stayed level. Then a single tear escaped her left eye, rolling down her cheekbone with the kind of terrible inevitability that makes onlookers feel like they're witnessing something they shouldn't. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Hargrove, her movement sharp as a blade finding its sheath. The silence in the room became almost physical. You could feel it pressing against the fluorescent lights overhead, could hear the soft electronic hum of the monitors in the background like the world holding its breath. "I hope your ego is worth more than your patience, Doctor." The words came out quiet enough that only the front 3 rows heard them clearly, but they carried the weight of someone who had already survived worse than public humiliation. Hargrove's face flushed crimson, a vein appearing at his left temple like a fault line cracking through marble. His mouth opened. Closed. He turned back to the podium without responding, which was somehow worse than any comeback he could have delivered, because it meant he had nothing. The silence stretched for 4 more seconds before he moved to the next case. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days later, Natalie was at the vending machine on the 3rd floor, 2:47 p.m., the 15-minute window between shift changes when the hallways cleared enough for a moment's peace. She'd pressed the button for black coffee, the kind that tasted like the hospital cafeteria had tried to weaponize it. The machine hummed. The cup fell. She reached down to retrieve it. Hargrove appeared with 6 interns trailing behind him like ducklings, their faces already resigned to whatever was about to happen. He didn't wait for her to straighten. His voice carried deliberately loud, the kind of volume designed to carry down the corridor and into the ears of every staff member within range. "Nurses who think they're doctors usually end up in malpractice court, Hayes. I've seen it 100 times, overconfident, undereducated, and utterly dangerous." His hand gestured vaguely at the interns as if they were his witnesses. "It destroys careers. Destroys families. And it gets patients killed." The interns stared at their phones with the intensity of people trying to teleport themselves elsewhere. One of them, a 3rd-year resident named Chen, looked directly at Natalie with something like apology in his eyes before looking away again. Natalie said nothing. She selected her coffee from the dispenser with the kind of unhurried precision that came from having learned decades ago that silence was the only weapon that never misfired. The cup was warm in her hand. She turned and walked away, passing directly beside Hargrove without acknowledgement, her white sneakers silent on the tile floor. Behind her, she heard him continue speaking to the interns, already constructing some narrative about her departure as validation of his point. She made it to the break room, closed the door, and spent 4 minutes staring at the coffee without drinking it. Not trembling. Not raging. Just breathing. The radiator beneath the window clanked like something living inside the walls, and she focused on that sound instead of the tightness in her chest. Pain was information. Fear was useful data. Humiliation was just a story someone else was trying to write, and she didn't have to finish their sentences. Thursday night came like an inevitability, which meant ICU rounds where Natalie was updating charts for the patients in her section, room for 47, where the major lay with his eyes still unable to track the woman whose name was tattooed across his right forearm in ink that had more meaning than he could currently access. His vitals were deteriorating in small increments that the day shift had logged but not contextualized. Temperature up 0.3 degrees. Respiration rate creeping from 16 to 19. His oxygen saturation holding at 94%, which was fine until it suddenly wasn't. Natalie pulled his chart and noticed something the radiology note had buried on page 3, a small effusion around the pericardium, noted but not flagged, probably missed by the attending because it was technically within normal limits. Except nothing about it felt normal to her. The major had sustained blunt force trauma 3 weeks ago. Pericardial bleeds could be delayed. They could hide. They could accumulate silently until the heart could no longer function inside its own fluid prison. She found Hargrove at the nursing station reviewing lab work with the same expression of supreme confidence he wore whenever he was about to make a significant error. The major in 447 is showing signs of possible pericardial fluid accumulation, she said, keeping her voice level and professional. I'd recommend we switch his antibiotics. His kidney function is declining and the current regimen is too aggressive for his creatinine levels. The vancomycin should be reduced to every 18 hours instead of. Hargrove spun toward her like she'd physically struck him. His voice dropped to that dangerous quiet that meant his rage had moved beyond volume into something colder and more calculated. Are you practicing medicine without a license, Nurse Hayes? Because I can have security escort you out right now for that. His hand actually moved toward the phone mounted on the wall. The gesture was theatrical, the kind of threat delivered for maximum audience impact. 2 other nurses were within earshot. An intern stood frozen at the coffee station like a deer in approaching headlights. Hargrove's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a man who had finally cornered his prey. Natalie's composure never fractured. One breath. Calm eyes that could have belonged to someone staring out at a desert at dawn, watching for movement that hadn't yet appeared. Only trying to keep your patient alive, doctor. She made the chart notation anyway, documenting her observation and her recommendation in clinical language that left no room for ambiguity. Hargrove watched her write. His jaw clenched in a way that suggested he was already planning something, already moving pieces across an invisible chessboard where she was nothing but a problem to be solved. That was when he saw his opening. The next morning, Hargrove activated his network with the precision of someone orchestrating an operation. First call, Hospital Board President Daniel Carlisle at his home in Ghent, a medical school classmate from Duke who'd owed him 3 major referrals over the past 8 years. The call came at 0630, early enough to feel important, early enough that Carlisle would still be groggy and therefore less resistant to suggestion. We have a liability issue, Hargrove said, his voice perfectly measured. A nurse with a pattern of dangerous independence, and I need your support for termination before she kills someone. I have documentation. He didn't have documentation yet. But he would. Second move, he contacted Natalie's nursing school references at the University of Virginia, digging through her academic record with the efficiency of someone who'd learned how to manipulate institutional systems. He found nothing useful, transcripts were exemplary, clinical reviews across 4 years of training consistently mentioned her steady hands and clear judgment. All of it pristine. All of it infuriating because it left him nothing to weaponize. So he kept digging deeper. Third escalation, he brought in Meridian Risk Management, an outside consulting firm that specialized in institutional liability documentation, paying for a rush review out of his research budget, $4,200 that he carefully buried in a conference line item. The consultant arrived on Friday morning with a tablet and a practice smile, spending 2 full shifts shadowing Natalie's work, recording every independent decision, every moment she acted without explicit written physician orders. By Sunday night, Hargrove had his file. 17 instances of autonomous clinical judgment without attending authorization. 9 documented protocol deviations. 5 explicit challenges to physician authority. Each one photographed, time-stamped, notarized with the kind of official seal that made ordinary nursing care look like mutiny. But there was something else in her HR file that he discovered while building the termination case. A redacted personnel record with a Department of Defense classification marker. He couldn't access the details. Federal security restrictions were actually enforced, which was irritating, but the existence alone intrigued him. A civilian trauma nurse with military records sealed at that level? With skills that sometimes seemed almost precognitive in their accuracy. With a presence in the room that made attending physicians unconsciously defer to her judgment. He made notes. Plans. The classified file would become his ace card, evidence of undisclosed background issues that complicated her fitness for employment. If she was hiding military service, what else was she hiding? What other deceptions lurked beneath that composed facade? Meanwhile, in room for 47, the Major's vital signs continued their subtle decline. The day shift had missed the accumulating fluid around his heart. The overnight shift would miss it too. Nobody was watching with the kind of attention that saved lives. Nobody except the woman standing against the wall during grand rounds, the woman whose judgment Hargrove had just systematically dismantled in front of 40 witnesses and a visiting medical staff from 3 separate institutions. The shift had been quiet until it wasn't. Natalie was 37 minutes into her 2300 to 0700 rotation at Valley Memorial when the monitors told her the story nobody else was reading yet. Room for 47. The Major's oxygen saturation had drifted down over the course of an hour, nothing alarming on paper, just a slow descent from 96 to 91 to 87, but she'd learned in Ramady that the slow things killed you faster than the sudden ones. The sudden ones you saw coming. The slow ones wrapped around your throat before you noticed the pressure. She checked on him at 0227 hours. Routine vitals. That's what the chart would say. Routine. But the moment she stepped through the doorway, her body knew before her mind caught up. The Major's neck was wrong. His jugular veins distended like rope, engorged with blood that had nowhere to go. His chest rose and fell, but something underneath wasn't working, some fundamental mechanism of the heart that nobody taught you in nursing school because they assumed the doctors would handle it, the doctors would notice, the doctors would care enough to look. His blood pressure was 78/42. Dropping. Heart sounds muffled. Like listening to a heartbeat through water. Through blood. Pericardial tamponade. Blood filling the sac around his heart, squeezing it like a fist closing around a bird. Minutes until complete cardiac arrest. Maybe 2. Maybe less. She didn't call a code yet. She moved. Muscle memory took over the way it had in field hospitals outside Fallujah when there was no time for protocol, no attending physician 3 minutes away, only hands and training and the mathematics of survival. She hit the code button with her palm, sharp, deliberate, and the intercom crackled with the monotone announcement that would bring the cavalry, but the cavalry was for minutes away minimum and the Major had 2, maybe 90 seconds if she was lucky. Protocol demanded she wait for a physician. Protocol was written by people who'd never held someone's hand as they coded out in the dark. The crash cart was 15 feet from her station. She covered the distance in 3 strides, muscle memory moving her fingers through the setup before her conscious mind caught up. Cardiac needle kit. 18 gauge. She grabbed it with the certainty of someone who'd done this before, someone whose hands remembered things her voice could never admit. The kit came apart in her grip. She'd performed this procedure in a convoy outside Ramady with nothing but a field pack and the sound of helicopters coming, and her hands had remembered it perfectly then because forgetting meant the Major would die on the hood of a Humvee with 3 rounds still in his chest. Room for 47 was silent except for the ventilator's wheeze and the steady beep of the monitor climbing upward through numbers that meant death was close. She didn't run. Running panics people. Running makes the heart beat faster and the pressure drop sharper. She walked the way a predator walks, smooth, certain, every movement a commitment. The Major's eyes were open but unfocused, his brain already beginning to shut down from lack of perfusion, the neural pathway starving for oxygen. She prepped the subcostal approach. Xiphoid process. The small bony landmark at the base of the sternum where rib cage met abdomen. Angle 45 degrees toward the left shoulder. Advance slowly. The needle was 14 gauge, long enough to reach the pericardium, small enough that she could feel the subtle resistance change when the tip broke through the fibrous sac. The major's skin was cool under her gloved hand. His breathing shallow. 60 seconds, maybe. Talk to me, she said. Not a question. A command, the voice she never used on this floor, the voice that belonged to someone else entirely. Stay with me, sir. His eyes flickered. Just barely. Some part of him heard her. Some part of him was still there in the body that was dying. The needle advanced. She felt it the way a safecracker feels a lock opening, that precise moment when resistance gives way and you know you're in the right place. The flash of blood came dark and immediate. Not bright red arterial blood. Dark venous blood mixed with serum, the accumulated hemorrhage from a bleed that had started slow 3 days ago and been waiting for this moment to finish its work. She aspirated. Smooth. Steady. The syringe filled with 60 milliliters of dark blood, and she watched the monitor as it happened. The major's blood pressure climbing. 78 to 82. 82 to 88. Oxygen saturation rising as his heart could finally pump, as the physical constraint around it released like a fist unclenching. His chest rose deeper. His color shifted from dusky gray to something closer to human. The monitor went from a panicked rhythm back to something resembling sinus rhythm. Regular. Strong. The kind of heartbeat that meant survival. The code team arrived 90 seconds later to find the major stabilized, Natalie documenting the procedure with the blood-filled syringe on the tray as evidence of what she'd done, what she'd authorized without authorization, what protocol for bad and survival demanded. The attending physician on call, a woman named Dr. Chen who actually paid attention, stared at the setup long enough for her eyes to widen, long enough for the calculation to register that this was not the work of a nurse following procedure. This was the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She whispered it with the kind of weight that comes from understanding you're standing next to something hidden. Where did you learn to do that? Natalie was already documenting the vital signs. Already documenting the procedure steps with the precision of someone filing evidence. Already preparing the narrative that would damn her. The charge nurse, a Maria, 3 years at Valley Memorial, 2 kids and a mortgage, was already on the phone with Hargrove at home per protocol. Any critical incident. Any unauthorized procedure. Any deviation from the chain of command got reported at 0243 in the morning to the man who'd been waiting for exactly this moment since the day Natalie had questioned him during grand rounds. I learned what works, Natalie said quietly. She didn't look at Dr. Chen. She was checking the major's pupils, watching them respond to the light of her penlight, reactive, round, equal. The baseline of consciousness returning. Pericardiocentesis. 60 ccs of blood. His heart was being compressed. He would have arrested in 90 seconds. You performed that without a physician present, Dr. Chen said. Not an accusation. An observation. The kind of statement that belonged in a report, in documentation, in the permanent record that would follow Natalie out of this hospital if she was lucky or bury her if she wasn't. His heart stopped, Natalie said. I stopped it. The words came out flat. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Just factual. The way you describe physics. The way you describe survival. But Dr. Chen's face had already shifted into the expression of someone who understood the implications, who saw the protocol violation as clearly as she saw the living, breathing patient who should have been dead but wasn't. Those two facts couldn't coexist in the same hospital system. One of them would have to be sacrificed. Hargrove arrived at 0317 hours. Natalie was still in room for 47, monitoring the major's vitals, running blood work, doing the 1,000 small tasks that kept patients alive after crisis. She heard his footsteps in the hallway first, the particular rhythm of someone moving with purpose, with anger controlled just tightly enough to look professional. He entered without knocking. The attending and the charge nurse fell away, instinct telling them this wasn't a medical conversation anymore. "Walk me through it," he said. Not a request. The voice of someone who'd already decided the outcome and was just collecting the documentation. She told him exactly what happened. The distended jugular veins. The muffled heart sounds. The dropping blood pressure. The procedure that should have required his authorization but didn't have time to wait for it, didn't have time to wait for him to arrive with his protocols and his policies and his need to be the singular decision-maker in every room on his floor. She told him with the composure of someone filing her own termination papers, the calm of someone who'd already accepted the cost. Hargrove listened to every word and smiled. That was the worst part. Not anger. Not rage. Satisfaction, bright and clear as a surgeon's light. He had the ammunition now. The unauthorized procedure. The deviation from chain of command. The evidence that she'd acted independently, made decisions without physician oversight, performed medical interventions that belonged to doctors and doctors alone. In the morning, he would frame it as recklessness. By noon, it would be documented as a pattern. By evening, he would have a termination letter written. He looked at the major's steady vital signs. At the monitors showing improvement. At the evidence of successful intervention that would become the evidence of her crime. "You understand what you've done," he said quietly. Not a question. Natalie checked the fall line one more time. Made sure the fluid was flowing at the proper rate. Did what the nurses do when there are no good answers. She cared for the patient in front of her and accepted the cost. "I understand," she said. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Hargrove didn't leave angry. He left satisfied, already writing the narrative in his mind, already calculating how this would look in a hearing, how he would frame her actions as independent decision-making that endangered patients, as a nurse who thought she was a doctor, as exactly the kind of threat to the hospital's liability structure that justified immediate termination. He would use her competence against her. He would use the fact that she'd saved a life to prove that she couldn't be trusted. And Natalie was left in room for 47 with the major, watching his oxygen saturation hold steady at 98%, watching his blood pressure stabilize at something close to normal, and understanding with the clarity of someone who'd survived worse things than this, that she'd just saved his life and ended her career in the same moment. Protocol would have let him die. Breaking protocol had let him live. But in the world that Hargrove built, the living patient was liability and the dead one was acceptable loss. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She just kept watching the monitors and doing the work that nurses do, the invisible work that nobody names and everybody depends on, and waited for the morning to come and take everything from her. Hargrove didn't wait for morning rounds. He convened an emergency administrative review at 0600 hours, pulling the night shift charge nurse and the risk management consultant into his office while Natalie finished charting at a workstation that suddenly felt like enemy territory. The consultant's report was already printed, already damning, a performance of invasive procedure outside scope of practice. Violation of physician supervision requirements. Unauthorized use of restricted medical equipment. Hargrove added his own observations in a voice that carried the satisfaction of a predator closing in, pattern of insubordination. Repeated challenges to medical authority. Dangerous autonomous action. He called her into his office at shift change. The charge nurse sat in the corner, her face apologetic and trapped. 2 security guards waited by the door like furniture, present, unmovable, inevitable. Natalie walked in with her shoulders level, her breathing even. The dog tag was already in her pocket, the chain broken weeks ago but never repaired. She had carried broken things before. Hargrove sat behind his desk, a slab of mahogany that cost more than most people's cars, and waited for her to speak first. She didn't. She never did. Silence was her language now, measured as a surgical instrument. Nurse Hayes, effective immediately, your employment at Valley Memorial is terminated for gross violation of clinical protocols and performing procedures outside your scope of practice. Each word was articulated with the precision of someone who had practiced this moment 100 times in his mind. You will collect your personal items from your locker and exit the facility with security escort. You will surrender your badge and access credentials. You will not attempt to contact patients, staff, or hospital administration. The charge nurse looked at the floor. Natalie stood silent for 5 seconds. Just 5. In those 5 seconds, the fluorescent lights hummed their thin electrical song, and somewhere down the corridor, a code blue monitor beeped its urgent rhythm, and she thought about Major Caldwell's blood pressure climbing back to 94 systolic, and his eyes opening like a man waking from the dead because her hands had done what his doctors said couldn't be done. "I saved his life," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. Didn't crack. Didn't plead. It was the voice of someone stating a fact, the way you might say the sky is blue or Ramadi was 118 degrees in August. Just information. Just truth. Hargrove smiled, a smile like a knife finding the gap between ribs. "You broke the law, Nurse Hayes. There's a difference. Security will escort you out." The guards moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this 100 times before. Not roughly. Not unkindly. Just professionally. One of them held the elevator, the other walked 3 steps behind her. Natalie walked to her locker with her head level, her breathing steady. She had walked out of more dangerous places than this. She grabbed the single item she kept in her locker, a framed photograph of a mountain range, nothing identifying, nothing that anyone could use against her, and left everything else, her extra scrubs, her personal stethoscope, the sweater she'd worn on her first day 6 years ago. The dog tag and broken chain were already in her scrub pocket. The lobby at 0645 was flooding with day shift nurses and residents, the morning shift change creating a river of people in scrubs and white coats. Their conversation stopped. Not all at once. In waves. A nurse near the coffee station saw her walking with security on either side. She nudged her colleague. That colleague's eyes tracked her path toward the exit doors. By the time Natalie reached the glass doors leading to the parking garage, the morning shift had gone quiet, and she could feel their stares the way you feel heat from a fire, not touching her, but undeniable. Nobody spoke. The parking garage was dim, the kind of fluorescent-lit dimness that never quite felt like day or night, always existing in some liminal space between morning and the rest of forever. Her car was 3 levels down, parked in the same spot she'd claimed 6 years ago, back when she was still just a nurse and not yet a threat. The security guards waited at the garage entrance until she reached her vehicle. Professional courtesy. One of them nodded, not unkind, just businesslike, before they turned back toward the hospital entrance. She was alone now. The kind of alone that echoes. She sat in her car with the engine dead and her head pressed against the steering wheel. The plastic was cool against her forehead. Her hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the slow release of adrenaline, the way a soldier's hands shake an hour after combat ends. The trembling was her body asking questions her mind wouldn't answer yet. 2 hours. She sat there for 2 hours while the morning light changed the quality of the garage from purple-gray to pale and then to the harsh white of a hospital parking structure at 0900. Her phone never rang. Nobody texted. Nobody came looking. The hospital had moved on, Major Caldwell's blood pressure was stable, his cardiac output was nominal, and his trauma surgeon had updated his chart to note successful hemodynamic restoration following emergency decompression, with the operative surgeon listed as the attending physician. The truth was already being rewritten. She finally turned the key at 0847. The engine caught like a heartbeat returning. She gripped the dog tag in her fist, the edges of the metal pressing crescents into her palm, pain as evidence, pain as information, and drove home to an apartment that had never felt like anything except a place to sleep between shifts. The scrubs were still damp with the Major's blood when she peeled them off. She sat on her couch in the afternoon light filtering through blinds she never opened, and she held the dog tag and didn't cry. Not because she was strong. Not because she was broken. But because somewhere between the day she'd enlisted at 22 and the morning she'd performed emergency surgery on a man her hands had carried through an Iraqi city while bullets tore through the air around her like angry wasps, she had learned that some things required absolute stillness. The apartment was quiet in the way that empty places are quiet, not peaceful, just absent. The absence of witnesses. The absence of anyone who had seen what she'd done, anyone who would vouch for the fact that she had walked into that ICU at 0227 hours and seen a man dying and made a decision that the law didn't permit but that basic human survival demanded. Nobody would name it for what it was. They would call it protocol violation. Outside her scope of practice. Unauthorized intervention. They would never call it heroism, because heroism only exists when someone is watching. She had retired from Special Forces 3 years ago specifically to avoid this, the weight of being defined by what she could do instead of who she was. She'd chosen nursing because it was healing without the gun, care without the camouflage, the chance to save lives in a place with fluorescent lights instead of in the scorching dust of a place the news called a war zone. She had been meticulous about her boundaries. Never mentioning her service unless someone specifically asked. Never applying for any positions that would require or expose her military background. Never letting anyone in the hospital know that the quiet nurse with the scarred hands and the steady eyes had walked into a burning building in Ramadi with 3 bleeding operators across her shoulders and walked out with all of them still breathing. That invisibility had been a choice. A deliberate choice to be small, to be safe, to be just a nurse. Hargrove had destroyed that choice by going looking for something to use against her. His investigation, meant to build evidence for her termination, had cracked open her classified file like an oyster, and now the Department of Defense knew that the woman he'd fired for protocol violation was the same woman who had carried 3 wounded men through 4.8 kilometers of hostile territory while enemy fire turned the air into something thick and lethal and alive. The Pentagon knew now. That phone call was already in motion. She didn't know it yet, but the machine was turning. She just sat in the dim apartment and held the broken chain and waited for whatever happened next. The Major's eyes cleared for the first time in 6 days. He was sitting up in room 447 when it happened, oxygen mask loose around his neck, morning light cutting through the Venetian blinds in sharp white lines. His hand moved across the tattoo on his forearm, Natalie Hayes in block letters, and his lips formed 2 words before the morphine fog settled again. Reaper 6. Just a whisper. Just a name he couldn't possibly remember because the traumatic brain injury had taken everything before he could take one more breath in that Ramadi street. But a Marine colonel visiting the next bed heard it. The colonel, silver oak leaves on his collar, standing by the window with coffee in a paper cup, went absolutely still. He pulled his phone from his uniform pocket, scrolled through something, read aloud from the screen, Captain Natalie Hayes, Silver Star, for carrying 3 wounded operators under sustained fire through Ramadi. His voice was steady but it filled the entire room like an announcement. Like a ceremony. Citation date, March 14, 2019. The Major's hand trembled, the first real emotion breaking through the fog, and he turned his head toward where Natalie had been standing 3 minutes earlier. But the door was already opening. Hargrove. His white coat moving like a sigh through the room, his jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscles pulsing beneath his skin. He didn't shout, which was worse. The quiet ones are always worse. Hearing's over. His voice came out flat and surgical. Everyone out. Now. That's not a request, Colonel. The Marine colonel didn't move. Hargrove stepped closer, his presence making the air pressure change, and repeated himself with the kind of control that comes from someone watching their entire world collapse in real time. I said out. The colonel left. But he'd already read the words. Already spoken the truth that lived in classified files and Pentagon databases. Already named the woman Hargrove had tried to erase with a single termination letter and a falsified paper trail. 48 hours. That's all it took for the Pentagon to move. The investigators arrived at Valley Memorial at 0630 on a Tuesday morning, 2 DOD officers in pressed service dress uniforms, carrying badges and federal warrants, asking questions not about Natalie's unauthorized pericardiocentesis but about Dr. Marcus Hargrove's unauthorized access to classified service records. The digital forensics team had found everything. Personnel file timestamps altered by 47 minutes to create the appearance that negative reviews existed before the emergency procedure. Performance evaluations edited after the fact document metadata showing modifications on the same night Hargrove had called the board president. The risk management consultant's billing records showing $8,000 charged for a rush evaluation of someone already selected for termination. Emails from nursing school references admitting Hargrove had called them asking them to recall any concerns, even minor ones, and offering to help refresh their memory. Wire fraud across federal systems. Falsification of employment records. Misuse of classified information for personal financial benefit. The consultant had billed for work predicated on a predetermined outcome. The nursing school had been pressured to fabricate complaints. The board president's phone records showed the call happened, though he suddenly couldn't quite remember the exact substance of that conversation. The network that had protected Hargrove for 15 years, the favors, the alliances, the golf club friendships, collapsed like a building with its foundation removed. FBI agents arrived at 1,430 hours. Two of them, one with a warrant in an official folder, the other with handcuffs already unclipped from her belt. They found Hargrove in the ICU corridor during afternoon rounds, the same hallway where he'd threatened to have security escort Natalie out. The same corridor where he'd announced to a crowd of interns that the nurses who think they're doctors usually end up in malpractice court. They didn't read him his rights in the doctor's lounge or some private office. They walked him out past the charge nurse, the same nurse who'd witnessed his humiliation campaign. Past the vending machine where he'd cornered Natalie 2 years earlier. Past the conference room where he'd used her as a negative example during grand rounds, his voice dripping with contempt while she stood silent against the wall. One handcuff clicked. Then the other. His face had gone the color of old hospital walls. The other doctors stopped what they were doing. No one looked directly, but everyone watched. The federal agents moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators, their movement speaking a language Hargrove's hospital credentials couldn't translate. Outside, the rain had started. It hammered against the hospital entrance like applause, and the federal vehicle was waiting with its engine running. His attorney negotiated a plea within 72 hours. Wire fraud charges reduced in exchange for voluntary surrender of his medical license, not just suspension, not probation, but permanent removal from any clinical practice. 2 years probation. $50,000 fine. Permanent ban from performing surgery or teaching at any accredited institution. The state medical board moved toward permanent revocation. His career, built over 3 decades, ended in a courtroom on a Thursday morning. The news spread through Valley Memorial like oxygen through blood. The charge nurses mentioned it to the residents told the interns, the medical students read about it in a Reddit thread. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, once chief of surgery, was reassigned to teach CPR certification courses at Norfolk Community College for $13 an hour. A man who'd trained surgeons now teaching compressions to high school students and dental hygienists. A cautionary tale in risk management seminars. A name whispered in hospital corridors as a reminder of what happens when power becomes a weapon. But that wasn't the worst part for Hargrove. The worst part was watching the woman he'd tried to destroy be reinstated with a formal written apology from the hospital board. The worst part was the check for back pay, 18 months of lost wages, calculated to the penny. The worst part was the offer to lead Valley Memorial's new trauma response training program, though Natalie declined it with a single sentence, "I prefer bedside care." She could have taken the position. Could have climbed the ladder. Could have sat in an office overlooking the ER and watched other nurses do the work she'd perfected through combat and sacrifice. Instead, she chose the fluorescent lights and the monitors and the 4 stands and the hands-on work of keeping people alive when their bodies decided to fail. The board president himself came to her first shift back, walking toward her station with his shoulders squared. "Captain Hayes, I owe you an apology that words can't repair." He didn't call her Natalie. Didn't pretend they were colleagues on equal footing. He used her rank, the one she'd carried for 12 years before trading boots for scrubs. She nodded once. That was enough. The charge nurse who had witnessed the firing brought her a coffee, black, no sugar, the way she remembered, and said quietly, "I'm sorry we didn't stop him sooner." Natalie accepted the coffee and squeezed her hand. No words necessary. The trauma attending who'd responded to the code on the night she'd saved the major asked if she'd be willing to teach the pericardiocentesis procedure to the residents. "So they know what right looks like," he said. She agreed. Because teaching them meant other people would live. Because healing wasn't about titles or rank or vindication. Healing was just the work. The continuous, quiet, exhausting work of showing up and being good at what you do. She opened her locker before her first shift and found the dog tag waiting. Single piece of worn metal on a broken chain, no name engraved on it, no service number, just the tarnished surface of something that had survived things it shouldn't have. Beside it was a note in careful handwriting, the penmanship of a man still relearning motor control. "I remember now. Thank you for carrying me home twice." She picked up the tag and held it for a moment, the weight of it almost nothing in her palm. Almost nothing and everything. That afternoon, she visited room for 47. The major was sitting in the chair by the window, not the bed, his uniform jacket folded carefully on the mattress beside a duffel bag. Discharge papers. Transfer orders to Walter Reed. His eyes found hers the moment she stepped through the door, and for the first time since she'd started at Valley Memorial, she saw clarity in them. The fog was gone. The confusion had lifted like weather moving off the Atlantic. He stood up slowly, steadying himself, and his hand moved to the tattoo on his forearm, her name in block letters across the inside of his arm. "I couldn't say it then," he said quietly. "I can now. You saved my life in Ramadi." His voice cracked slightly. The kind of breaking that comes from held-back emotion finally released. "You saved it again here. I remember the firefight. I remember you carrying me. I remember everything." She took his hand. The skin was warm and solid, and for the first time in 6 days, there was recognition in his grip. "You're going to be all right," she said. It wasn't a question. He shook his head slowly. "Because of you. Because you knew who I was before I could remember." Before he was transferred to Walter Reed, he gave her the dog tag, his own, lost during the extraction in Ramadi, recovered months later by Marines who'd held it waiting for her to come home from deployment. He'd kept it all these years. Now it was hers, the broken chain still attached, the metal still warm from being held in his pocket. She carried it with her. Life at Valley Memorial returned to its rhythm. Fluorescent lights hummed their constant song. Antiseptic cut through the air like a surgical incision. Cold steel waited in supply carts. And Natalie's steady hands moved from room to room, saving lives without fanfare, without recognition, without needing anything except the knowledge that the work was good. On her locker she taped a single index card with 8 words in her own handwriting: "True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching." No one called her Little Miss Protocol anymore. No one whispered about insubordination or protocol violations. The vending machine still sat in the same place, humming its electric drone, but Hargrove wasn't there anymore to poison it with his contempt. Valley Memorial had moved forward without him, the way institutions do, healing the broken and forgetting the ones who'd tried to break them. And Natalie Hayes, captain in the Special Forces Reserve, nurse in a Norfolk hospital, was exactly where she'd chosen to be. The waiting was over. The reckoning was complete. What happened next was just the life she'd earned, one shift at a time, one heartbeat at a time, one person at a time. If you made it this far, you already know, the quiet ones are often the most dangerous. The ones who've seen the worst are often the ones who give the most. Subscribe now to see what happens when the next hero walks through your door, and drop a comment. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value? Let's talk about it.